Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of reasons. The first of which is to take my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of writing the sermon that I'm going to preach to my congregation for the weekend. And the second reason is just to allow you, the viewer, I've got bugs flying around here. That's kind of weird. You, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason brought you here, to gain some different insight into the sign text for the week. So that's why I do these. This coming Sunday, which is October 8th, 2017, the 18th Sunday after Pentecost, our gospel lesson comes out of Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 46. However, before I really kind of dive into that, I'm going to give some background and reference some of the other readings that we have. The other readings that are assigned this week in the lectionary, which we follow here in my church, we have a reading from Isaiah 5, 1 through 7. We have the assigned psalm for the week, Psalm 80, verses 7 through 15. We also have a reading out of Philippians 3. I'm going to kind of leave that one on the back burner because that one kind of has a little different thrust. But these other two readings, along with Matthew, all feature a similar theme, and it's the theme of the vineyard. I think that's important to bring up because within, particularly in the Old Testament, oftentimes the nation of Israel, or the Jewish culture, or the kingdom of Judah, sometimes it's called, is referred to as a vineyard, and we see that within all three of these readings. Again, not so much in the Philippians reading, but in the other ones. And I think it's important to bring this up because of the idea that the whether we want to call it the promised land for the Israelites or for the nation, or if it's the people, or however we want to refer to it, this image of the vineyard keeps coming up. And what we're going to see in these different passages, and in particular in the parable that's featured in Matthew's text, is the idea of the vineyard being taken away, and or that the vineyard has been taken away. And I bring this up because I think it represents kind of a cyclic thing that we continue to see within the overarching narrative. And if you've seen my videos before, you know sometimes I talk about that overarching narrative, this ongoing thing, the story that we continue to hear through the scriptures of God's promises to be faithful even amongst very dire circumstances. So when we have the Isaiah text, now this is going back a long ways, and it's actually very early in the book of Isaiah. Scholars believe that Isaiah, which is pretty lengthy in terms of an Old Testament book, was probably written, or parts of it were written at two or possibly even three different times. So sometimes scholars will talk about first Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah. It's all in the book of Isaiah, but thought that they were probably written at different points in Israel's history. But this one is quite early on, being only in the 5th chapter. And it's kind of a love song. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to kind of reference it. This is, of course, the word of the Lord that comes to the prophet. And he says, "Let me sing a song for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard." And we hear about and this would seem to be the people, the culture, the God's chosen people at the time of Israel, or time of Isaiah. So he talks about this vineyard and how wonderful it is, but things have taken a turn, and we hear, like partway through, "Now inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard." So clearly there's some issue, and we hear that when I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? What will I do to my vineyard? I will remove its hedge; it will be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste; it will not be pruned or hoed. It shall be overgrown with briars and thorns, and on and on and on. So God is talking about what he had hoped would come out of this nation of priests, is how the Old Testament oftentimes refers to the people of Israel, God's chosen people, that they will be a light shining in the darkness for the people around them to see this is how we live in a good relationship with one another and with God. So the image of the vineyard, we're told here, the vineyard will be taken away. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. Now, if I skip into the Psalm, again, it's Psalm 80, now we hear kind of This is a lament. And I will flip through this. Restore us, O God of hosts. Let your face shine upon us, and we shall be saved. You have brought a vine out of Egypt. You cast out the nations and planted it. So clearly we're hearing you brought the people out of Egypt and planted them here in the promised land. You cleared the ground for it. It took root and filled the land. The mountains were covered by its shadow, et cetera, et cetera. It stretched out its tendrils to the sea and its branches to the river. So the people spread and took the promised land, took the nation of Israel, the area. But now we hear, it switches, why have you broken down its walls so that all who pass by pluck off its grapes? The wild boar of the forest has ravaged it, and the beasts of the field have grazed upon it. Turn now, O God of hosts, and look down from heaven. Behold and tend this vine. Preserve what your right hand has planted. So here now in the Psalms, we hear the lament that just as Isaiah had predicted that the vineyard, whatever we want to call it, will be taken away. Now it has been taken away. It has been destroyed. And this is a sense of exile. And this goes on within, again, within the history of Israel, that there's this cycle of we are a people who at times are oppressed, have been oppressed. We've been taken away. What God has promised has been removed from us, but we remain hopeful that God will restore it. And my understanding, and again, this is just my understanding, so don't take this as gospel, but my understanding is the Jewish sensibility is more about the culture, more about the people, rather than the individualistic faith of that God will be faithful to his promise to us as a people. If we think of Egypt going all the way back to the book of Exodus, 400 years they're in slavery in Egypt, and they cry out to God for deliverance, and God hears them. And finally, after 400 years, God sends Moses, and there's that whole story, which I won't go down that rabbit trail, but that God has heard them, their cries as a people throughout the course of this exile, throughout this bondage. And then the 40 years of wandering, that God is with them, even though they are suffering. And then there's the back and forth and the long history within the promised land, and the establishment of the kingdoms, and then the breakdown of the kingdoms into the two kingdoms, and then eventually we have the Assyrians that come in, and there's the first exile, the Assyrian exile, and later on there's the Babylonian exile, and then the Greeks have come in, and the Persians have come in, and eventually the Romans come in by the time of Jesus. So there's this constant state of oppression, and there's what's called the diaspora, which is a big fancy word for the Jewish people being spread all over because of well, a lot of things, because of what's the word I'm looking for? Persecution, because of the various exiles, all kinds of stuff. So they've spread all over. But the state is that God will be faithful to restore the vineyard. That God will be faithful to restore the people. That the promise is God is with us in the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the darkness, but that God will deliver us from it. So that's the cycle that we see. And now, all that being said, I want to come out to Matthew, because this image is still utilized, and Jesus is telling a parable. This is the next in several parables we've had the last few weeks, and kind of continuing as Jesus is butting heads with the religious elite in the temple. He's in Jerusalem. This actually occurs during Holy Week, during his final week before his crucifixion. And so they question his authority of why do you come in and teach what you teach? Why the cleansing of the temple had happened? Why did you come in and throw all the tables over and drive everyone out? By what authority do you do this? So they're questioning the status quo. They're questioning why he thinks he can say what he says and challenge them as he does. And his response continues to be about the kingdom of heaven and how the unexpected will be the ones to inherit it, and those who were entrusted with it, the chief priests and the Pharisees and the elders, that they're not doing their jobs, that they're not tending the vineyard, and that's what this particular parable is about. It's the parable of the wicked tenants. Again, it happens in Matthew 21:33 through 46, and we're going to jump into that now. And keep in mind what we've heard. In Isaiah, we've heard that the vineyard will be taken away. In Psalms, we've heard that the vineyard has been taken away. And now we're kind of getting back into this parable that seems to indicate that the vineyard will be taken away again. So Jesus is talking, and he says, listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to the tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and is amazing in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruit of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. All right, so that's the gospel passage for this week. So again, we hear, and this one to me, and others may hear this differently, but to me, this one seems so blatantly on the nose, speaking of the history, the cycle that we had kind of talked about, or that I mentioned, and maybe a little bit different, but that God had sent the prophets, that God had sent the judges, God had assigned the kings, those who were entrusted to guide, to shepherd the people. But that particularly the prophets would often come in to try and offer corrective. This is the word of the Lord, and like we heard in Isaiah, that because of this, the kingdom will be taken away from you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when we hear, first of all, that the landowner planted the vineyard, built the wall around it for protection, built the wine press, built the watchtower. To me, that's okay. God is the one who's created this world, and the vineyard seems to be the world in this case, at least maybe initially. And then he rents it to rent farmers, which are cash rent farmers, which is something that we're still familiar with today. That you farm the land, but when you harvest, a portion of it goes to the landowner. They sharecropping is maybe another way of saying it. But when it's time for the harvest, he sends his servants to collect his rent, his due. And I don't know what the heck the tenants are thinking. Like, what do they expect to happen? That they know that this is the terms of it, but they rough up the servants, and we hear that they kill one and they stone another one. To me, this is blatantly the prophets, that God has sent his prophets to you for corrective, and you treated them badly. And then we hear that he sends more, and the same thing happens. So there's more prophets. And then eventually he says, "Well, I will send my son. I will send the heir, and they will respect my son. They will respect his authority." But they see him, and this is where, again, it gets weird. The tenants are like, "Hey, it's the heir. Let's kill him, and we'll get the inheritance." What in the heck are they thinking? And that's something that admittedly I don't know how to make sense of within this parable. It's just odd that I don't get what they're thinking, that they think they can steal the inheritance. That's not how inheritance works. It seems kind of strange, but anyway, so they kill the son. So then he says, what happens when the master finally comes? Well, he'll put them to, and this is the answer, the judgment of his audience, of the Pharisees and the priests. They said, well, he'll put them to a miserable death. And I have to kind of laugh at the Greek of that is badly he will kill them. Bad badly, I don't know, it just makes me laugh. But then Jesus switches over and he begins to again reference back to the scriptures with his thought or his words about the cornerstone, the one that the builders had rejected has become the chief cornerstone. So then he says, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to the people who produce fruit of the kingdom. And with this, we begin to see that the importance of recognizing that this is not a parable against the Jewish culture. And oftentimes that's kind of what gets attributed to it. This isn't saying that the Jews are all bad. That's not what this is about. This is about saying that those who are entrusted with the care to tend the vineyard, if that is in fact Israel, or maybe it's the world, I don't know, but if it's Israel, those who've been entrusted with its care, with its tending, are not doing what they're supposed to. So it's going to be taken away from them and rented out to some who will do it. Now, we hear this on the tail end of the parable of the two sons, which was last week's, if you happen to catch that video. And we hear Jesus say that the tax collectors and the prostitutes who have heard and believed are going to enter into the kingdom ahead of you. So is that again what this is saying when he says that it's going to be taken away from you and given to others? That others who hear the good news and act upon it, they're the ones who will receive the kingdom or will tend the kingdom, will provide fruits for the kingdom, whatever that means. I think it means making disciples for the kingdom. I don't know. That's just spitballing. But so there's all that going on. Well, and now coming back around to this idea of exile that I mentioned before, I'm getting kind of long-winded here. I need to get this wrapped up. But the idea of exile to me is quite fitting. In the midst of what feels to me like a lot of darkness going on, and I got a reference back to Las Vegas last Sunday evening. Somebody, and I don't know the motivation. I don't even know what to call him. If we want to call him a domestic terrorist, if we want to call him a nut job, if we want to call him a troubled individual, whatever we want to call him, some nut job opened fire on a crowd at a concert, hurt 500 people, and more than 50 of them died. And it's again, I wish I could say this was isolated, but it's again. And in addition to the darkness that's hovering around that, we see the bickering that goes on around the issues of it. We see everything else that's happening in this dark world, and it feels like we're in exile. And that's why I brought up the other passages before. All of this is in exile. The darkness of this world. And I've been really wrestling with how do we reflect God's light shining in the darkness? How can we be what Jesus calls earlier in Matthew? How can we be the lamp placed upon the lampstand that gives light to the entire house? How can we be the city on a hill that cannot be hidden? How can we be that? How can we be the embodiment of God's light shining in the darkness? And I don't necessarily have a great answer to that. I might reference something else that if you happen to be seeing this on my Facebook, I posted this a day or two ago on my Facebook, a video about making a difference, our attitudes. And I referenced an old movie, Bruce Almighty, where we hear "Be the miracle." That if you want to see a miracle happen, go be part of it. Go do it. And maybe that's a very humanistic, works-oriented way of looking at miracles. And that's not necessarily my intention, but it's like, go be the change that you want to see in the world. I think maybe that's where I'm coming from. Now, all that being said, I got to reference back to Philippians now. And as I said, that kind of doesn't have the theme of the vineyard being taken away or having been taken away or going to be taken away again that we hear in the other three. But there's a passage that I love. This passage, the Apostle Paul wrote it, and he's talking about his human achievements, his human credentials, or his Jewish credentials are kind of the big thing. He talks about this and this and this and this and this, all of this thing that I am. If anyone has reason to boast because of humanly things, it's me because of this. And then he says, swearing alert, he says, for his sake, that being Jesus, I have suffered the loss of all things, all those things that he listed. I regard them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. Now, rubbish is a really nice way of saying I count it as shit. That's what the Greek is. And all of this stuff that we tend to think of as this is how we are great in the world. This is how we achieve. This is human expectations. All of that is a pile of shit compared with knowing Christ and being known by him. And that gospel right there, knowing Christ and being known by him, being claimed by God through Christ, I think that's the light of the light shining in the darkness of this exile that we oftentimes find, the separation that we find or we feel from that which is good. And how can we share that? How can we reflect that in the world? Now, this is, I'm just kind of stopping there because I don't know what else to say. This is kind of what's going on in my head this week as I deal with these texts and ponder on these texts and move towards the sermon. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, throw them down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, have a blessed week. May God be with you. If you feel this sense of unease about things in the world, particularly after the events in Las Vegas last weekend, may God watch over all of us around the world. We'll catch you next time.